I'm going to get started. As you all know, Shemitah just came to an end a couple of days ago. When I just passed Rosh Hashanah, so Shemitah's already ended. For farmers, that means is that the Shemitah's over. They're allowed to work on their lands, and the regular, what we think of the halachas of Shemitah don't apply anymore. But a number of the halachas of Shemitah do continue into the year after Shemitah, which is what we're holding right now. One of them is actually something that's going to be in this week's parsha, not directly related to Shemitah, and that is that the mitzvah of Hakel, in a time when they counted Yovel, they had a mitzvah of Hakel on the Sukkot after Shemitah, that unfortunately we're not going to have this year. But one group of halachas, and there are little halachas about vegetables, there are special rules of slichin, a little bit that apply after Shemitah ends, but by and large, vegetables that are harvested after Rosh Hashanah do not have any restrictions on them. They don't have kedusha shvius. There are no special rules to them. But what does apply is fruits. The way the halachas of Shemitah work is that fruits that grew a certain amount during Shemitah, they had a certain main part of their growth during Shemitah, those fruits have kedusha shvius. They have kedusha shvius regardless of when they get harvested. And therefore, for example, wine that from the grapes that grew during Shemitah will come to market in the next couple of months, and then will be around for a couple of years afterwards as they stay around on the market, and those will all have the special rules of Kedusha Shvius. And what we're going to talk about today is that for fruits, also most fruits are included in this din, and when they had their main growth during Shemitah, and when they come to market at the end of Shemitah or into the next year, they continue to have Kedusha Shvius. As an example, dates from Shemitah first came to market only a couple of days before Rosh Hashanah, and so as of that day, they started having Kedusha Shvius, and they had Kedusha Shvius for many months. As long as they stay on the market, they will have Kedusha Shvius. We're specifically talking about the Dalad Minim, coming up to Sukkot now, Dalad Minim, which is for many people in Chutz La'aretz, that's their only chance that they see produce from Eretz Yisrael. We're going to talk about the Kedusha Shvius for those different items. Okay, so we'll start with the simplest one. The simplest of the Dalad Minim, as far as it relates to Shemitah, is the Arava. Now, we rarely get Aravas from Eretz Yisrael, so we don't really have so much of a question. But the truth is that Arava is, as we say, as the Midrashim say, that Arava has no smell and no taste. So an Arava is just a plain piece of wood, and it for sure has no Kedusha Shvius to it. So there may be rules about what farmers can do as far as growing and taking care of their Aravas, but as far as people who have them, there's absolutely no restrictions or dinim at all relating to Aravas from Shemitah. Okay, so that's really the simplest one. Okay, our next one to talk about is going to be the Hadassim. Now, Hadassim, when people first think about whether a Hadas has Kedusha Shvius or doesn't have Kedusha Shvius, the natural first reaction everybody has is that, well, of course, Hadassim have no Kedusha Shvius, because Hadassim, you don't eat Hadassim, they're not edible, so most people would assume that they don't have Kedusha Shvius. In fact, there is a possible reason why it should have Kedusha Shvius, and that is that the Yerushalmi asks whether something that is meant for fragrance, it's grown specifically not to eat, but it's grown for fragrance, whether that should or should not have Kedusha Shvius. And the Yerushalmi doesn't answer that question, it leaves it hanging. And the Chazon Ish says that one should be machmir about that question and assume that that items that are grown specifically for fragrance do have Kedusha Shvius. And of course, an example of that is our Hadassim. Hadassim are used by people specifically for the smell of it. Think of there are Sfardim who use it every Mitzvah Shabbos for their besamim, and so it's something that's used for fragrance, and therefore there actually is a basis in this Yerushalmi. The Yerushalmi is not talking about Hadassim, but certain flowers, such as Hadassim, that are meant specifically for fragrance, potentially have Kedusha Shvius. Okay, so for now, hearing that, we would say that there would be a concern of Kedusha Shvius for Hadassim. Of course, we get many Hadassim from Eretz Yisrael. However, the Or Sameach has a reason to think that there should not be Kedusha Shvius. Okay, the Or Sameach, of all places to be, is in Hilchos Paraduma, and he's talking about the following. the Mishnah there says that one of the things you use when you make a paraduma is an Esrog, a certain bush, branches from a certain bush, and the din is things that are used for the paraduma need to be tahar to a much higher standard of tahara than we usually are accustomed to, and the din therefore is if the Esrog had been taken off the ground to be used as a food type item, then, and it even got it all wet, it already becomes too tamei to be able to be used for paraduma. Okay, even just getting wet is already enough to make it not fit for paraduma. But if you had cut it off the ground just to use it as a piece of wood, just as a branch, as a twig, then then the fact that it got wet does not affect it, and it could be used for the paraduma. So the Mishnah says, what happens if the person cut it off, not for either of those purposes, but he cut it off in order to use it for the mitzvah, for the paraduma? Then the din is, the Mishnah says is that it is considered to be a non-food item, and even if it gets wet, it stays tahar. So the Arsameach says, you see from there, that if something is cut specifically, taken off the ground specifically to be used for a mitzvah, then it doesn't have the status of a food. If it doesn't have the status of a food, means that it won't become, for this means it won't become tamei. For our purposes, it means it shouldn't have kedusha shvius either. So if so, he doesn't talk specifically about hadassim. We'll see what he speaks about in a second, but he says, therefore, items that are cut off with the intention of using them for the mitzvah do not have kedusha shvius, and therefore, that should apply basically to all of our hadassim. The hadassim that we have, not the hadassim that someone would buy in a florist, or hadassim someone would use for something. The hadassim we buy for sukkahs obviously were cut off for the mitzvah, and according to this Arsameach, they would have no kedusha shvius to it. So there are many who rely on it, and there are, between these two reasons, there are many who rely and assume that the hadassim that they get even from Eretz Yisrael, do not have kedusha shvius to them. So I guess you can go either way on this. Those are the parts of the question. First of all, should it maybe have kedusha shvius because it's intended for fragrance? And even if it does have, but theoretically kedusha shvius, does it have kedusha shvius when it is cut off specifically for the mitzvah? Okay, now we move on to what's the most. Before I move on, let me skip for a second. To go to a lulav. The question of whether a lulav from Eretz Yisrael should have kedusha shvius. So if you were to just open up a Gemara Sukkah, you would definitely walk away with the impression that a lulav has kedusha shvius to it. The Gemara talks about that the lulav have kedusha shvius. The Gemara is even bothered that there's a Mishnah that talks about how you get an Esrog on Shemittah without transferring money to the wrong person. We'll talk about a little bit more about that in a second. And the Gemara says, the Gemara strongly gives the impression that a lulav has kedusha shvius to it. And what would be the reason for lulav to have kedusha shvius? A lulav also, nobody eats lulav. Nobody eats those branches. So the reason why a lulav should potentially have kedusha shvius is because for Shemitah, not only do food items have kedusha shvius, but also ma'achal behema, things that animals eat, also have kedusha shvius. And on top of that, there's another thing. Anything which the use of the item also is the way it gets destroyed while you use it. The Gemara's mutahana also bi'ur and shava. When you use it and while you use it, it gets destroyed. That item also has kedusha shvius, even though it's not a food item at all. So the Rashi explains there that lulav branch, a palm branch, when it opens up, can be used as a broom. And as a broom, when you sweep with the broom, the use of the broom happens together with it getting worn out. And therefore, it should have kedusha shvius. So the simple reading of the Gemara is that a lulav does have kedusha shvius, to the point that the Rambam, who does not say that a lulav has kedusha shvius, the Mefarshim will speak about why doesn't he say that? Why doesn't he tell us that a lulav has kedusha shvius? And there's this back and forth, different opinions whether a lulav does or does not have kedusha shvius. What the Rambam really holds, whether he does or doesn't have kedusha shvius. There's an interesting thing in Rav Kapach's version of the Pirush of Shnais Rambam. He brings that the Rambam and his Pirushim Shines on that Mishnah first wrote one explanation as to why, one reason as to why Lulav in the Mishnah doesn't have Kedusha Shvius. That reason was more consistent with what the Gemara says, and then it was crossed out, and in his own handwriting, it's written on the side a different reason as to why he thinks it doesn't have Kedusha Shvius. And yes, there's a back and forth discussion as to whether the Rambam holds it or doesn't hold of it, but in Halacha L'Maisa, it's not relevant to us because Rosh Hashanah Auerbach says, he says, listen, he says that whole discussion, the whole beginnings is because it works with an assumption that people take their palm branches and make brooms out of them. But that's not something that many regular people do nowadays. I mean, by no means is that the common way to use a palm branch nowadays. And for us, it's basically just a piece of wood. And the Mela, nowadays, it wouldn't have Kedusha Shvius. So it's a theoretical question in the Gemara whether in those days it should have had Kedusha Shvius, but nowadays for us it for sure does not have Kedusha Shvius. That's an assumption that people work with, that the lulavim they get from Eretz Yisrael don't have any Kedusha Shvius. We work with that. Rosh Hashanah speaks about whether that same rule should apply to food items. What would be if there was a food item that people don't eat very much of? But in a lulav, which is a non-food item, he says it's really clear that if nobody uses it anymore in a way that would be Hanas Abir and Shava, then it does not have Kedusha Shvius. Okay? So that leaves us with just one of the Daled Minim. The Esrog, which is, again, the most famous one, is the question of should it or should not have Kedusha Shvius. So, as I mentioned, the Mishnah talks about that an Esrog has Kedusha Shvius. The obvious reason why an Esrog has Kedusha Shvius is because it's edible. Think of going to the fruit store buying lemons, or people make Esrog jam out of it. In other countries, particularly, they use it all the time. So it has Kedusha. It is assumed to have Kedusha Shvius, and there is a machlokes as to which Esrog has Kedusha Shvius. We work with the assumption that the Ikar Hadin is that the Esrog that grew during Shemitah that has Kedusha Shvius, that is to say, the Esrog we have for this year, but there is a sheet of the Rambam that says that it also has Kedusha Shvius if it was harvested during Shvius, which would mean is that last year the Esrog could have had Kedusha Shvius, but also, although the din does not, it's not like the Rambam, people are machmir, and they'll harvest last year's Esrogim. A year ago, they harvested their esrogim before Shemitah started to avoid that problem. Okay, but we're holding today with the esrogim we have that come from Eretz Yisrael would have grown during Shemitah and had Kedusha Shvius. So now, the first question we have, the first thing we have to just mention is that if a person were to get an esrog from someone who did not keep the halachos of Shemitah, he got an esrog from someone who was not being particular to follow the regular dinim of Shemitah. As an example, if I'm a person who would not accept the kulas that come along with the heter mechira, but the farmer did. So the farmer grew the esrog and did not treat it at all with kedusha. He didn't treat it in the way he was supposed to. He didn't grow it and harvest it and take possession of it in the way he should have, according to my way of seeing it. Then the din is that esrog, although he may have done the wrong thing, that esrog remains kosher for the mitzvah. But we'll see in a second, there are restrictions about buying that esrog. But the esrog itself remains kosher for the mitzvah. Okay, but most of the esrog we're going to see here in Chicago, well, lots of them, we've spoken to some of the merchants, lots of them are going to be coming from, lots of the esrog we're going to see are going to be coming from Chutz La'aretz. They don't have any Shemitah questions at all. But the merchants also told us that most of them said they will be carrying esrogim from Eretz Yisrael. So those esrogim that we're going to see are primarily not going to be ones from farmers who did not keep Shemitah, or from farmers who rely on the heter mechira, but rather we're going to see esrogim that are from Oitzer Bezdin. What's an Oitzer Bezdin? Oitzer Bezdin means the following. If during Shemitah, fruits and vegetables that grow are hefker. So that means that if someone has oranges growing in their backyard, or in their farm, they have 100 orange trees, then those oranges are hefker, and anybody who wants to can take them, which is wonderful. Everyone can go take them. Well, the thing is that it's a little inconvenient or a little inefficient to say that the oranges are hefker and everyone can take them when, especially nowadays, people don't live out by the farm. So the farmer's neighbors can all take an orange or two, but basically most of the oranges are going to go to rot and everyone else is not going to have what to eat. So, what the Tosefta says is, what you could do is you could set up the Bezdin, the community can arrange for someone to collect all the oranges from the field, take all those oranges and bring them to town, where the people who want them will be able to eat them. So, for example, if the farmer's he has his farm, and he has 100 orange trees, someone can come along, take the oranges off the tree, put them into boxes, and ship them into Bnei Brak, so the people in Bnei Brak can have oranges to eat during Shemitah. And that's called an Oitzer Bezdin, Bezdin's storehouse. Bezdin holds on to all these things for everybody, and they distribute them for free. The fruit is free because it's hefker. It was Shemitah produce, it's for free. Well, even though the fruit is for free, but Bezdin is allowed to charge for their expenses that they had in bringing those fruits to town, to the market. So, for example, if Bezdin hired someone to harvest them, and then they put them into boxes, and they hired someone to truck them into town, and they hired someone in town to stand there and give out the fruit and hand them out to everybody. All those expenses Bezdin could recoup. And in fact, nowadays it's become very popular, more and more popular each Shemitah, that they use Oitzer Bezdin. And what they'll do is the Bezdin will actually hire the farmer himself to be their representative. So the farmer who can't work his field on Shemitah, it gives him a chance to make some money. They can hire him to do that kind of work. Plus, the farmer is, of course, the one who's most suited. He knows very well how to harvest and package and deliver fruit. That's what he does all the time. So he's a great candidate to be that. So in fact, the Bezdin will hire those people, and those people will work for the Bezdin. So the Bezdin hires all these people, collects all the fruit, and sends them off to people, and that's called the Oitzer Bezdin. And the Eretz Yisrael, it doesn't happen just for Sukkot; it happens all the time. Bezdin harvests a certain fruit, brings it to town, and makes it available to people at whatever price they do. So the first, and that's the lots of the Israeli Esrog we're going to see are going to be coming through some sort of an Oitzer Bezdin. Excuse me. So the first question to be raised is so before I go on to my question, those fruit, of course, have Kedusha Shvius. They grew during Shemitah, they grew in Eretz Yisrael, they have Kedusha Shvius to them. The first question you have to ask is that the din is that a person is not allowed to export Perish Shvius out of Eretz Yisrael. You're not allowed to, one of the rules of Kedusha Shvius is that the produce has to stay in Eretz Yisrael. So how is it that we will ever see Esrogim have Kedusha from Oitzer Bezdin when one of the rules the Bezdin should have is that you can't export that produce? It's actually a very serious question. Chazon Ish Taka was machmir and said you should not. You should in fact not. A person maybe could take one out for themselves, but there shouldn't be mass exporting of them. Others are making and saying you can only export them if the merchants will take the Esrogim and bring them back to Eretz Yisrael in time for the beer. We'll talk about beer in a second. Bring them back to Eretz Yisrael before the beer. For our purposes, beer is the beginning of Shvat. Bring them back to Eretz Yisrael. And others are making it you can do it no matter what. You can just export them for the mitzvah. It's okay to do that. Now, when we spoke to the merchants, a number of them are getting produce from Eretz Yisrael. None of them offered a service to bring the Esrogim back to Eretz Yisrael after Sukkot. Now, maybe we didn't speak to everybody, but the ones who we spoke to did not offer any such option that a person can give it back. So the middle day, they're not satisfying that middle opinion. They're obviously not satisfying the Chazon Ish, and that obviously we will take it that they're being samech on the most lenient opinion that says that you can take it out of Eretz Yisrael even just for the mitzvah. Now, whether they're doing the right thing or the wrong thing, the merchants, whether they're doing the right thing or the wrong thing doesn't make a difference, so to speak, doesn't make a difference to us, in the sense that the esrog for sure remains kosher to use for the mitzvah. If it already got here to Chicago, we could use it for the mitzvah. Again, the merchant and all the people involved may have done the wrong thing, but from our perspective, they're still, the esrog still remains kosher. Now, a question we need to ask now is that, okay, so we have our esrog and we came from the Oitzer Bezdin. Now, if Bezdin prepared esrogim for all these people, Bezdin is allowed to recoup their cost. So they had a farmer who took care of the field before it grew, and then he harvested it, and then he packaged it, and he shipped it all the way here. He put it into little boxes, and he shipped it all the way here to Chicago. And then someone here locally took the esrog, and he put them up, and he opened a store. All these people are allowed to be paid for their services that they did. The question is that's fine, And let's say the cost for all of that service was $30. I'll make up a number. It was $30 for all that service. So we pay nothing for the fruit. The fruit is hefker. We pay $30 for the service of all that work that went into getting the esrog to my door. The question is, if so, all the esrogim should go for the same price. All the esrogim that are being sold all have the same amount of effort to produce them. It doesn't cost more to ship a gorgeous esrog than to ship a chinuch esrog. They're all the same. What's the difference? If the number is $30 it takes to get it all the way from there to here, then they should all be one price. And now, realistically, we're not going to see that. We're not going to see one price. In fact, most of the merchants told us that there's going to be a full range of prices. So, place can say that for different reasons, for Bezdin to function, one price is not realistic. They can't just have one price. If the price for every esrog would be $30, no, that's not a good example. If the price for every esrog would be $50, then there are some people who would buy them in a second because they used to pay more than that, and some people who wouldn't buy them at all. They really wouldn't sell after a certain. Some people want to pay only $30 for their esrog, for their chinuch esrog. So realistically, Bezdin can't just charge one flat price, and they say it's okay to charge a number of prices. But a way of preserving the idea that we're not charging for the fruit, when the better esrog is not charging more because the fruit is better, because we're not allowed to charge more for a fruit that one over the other, because the fruit itself is hefker. We're only charging it to help Bezdin recoup its cost. Therefore, the right way to do it is that the esrogim should come in closed boxes, which is to say the esrog should come sealed, and say, it could be in different groups. It could be a sug aleph esrog, and a sug beis esrog, and a chinuch esrog, or however many groups you want to make. But the fact that people get to choose, I want this one instead of that one, takes away from the fact that they're not supposed to be paying for the fruit. They're only supposed to be paying for all this labor, and labor-wise, there's no difference between the first one and the second one. They both have the same amount of effort going to them. So it's not such a great system to have in open boxes. In fact, most of the merchants here told us that they will be using open boxes, and you can pick whichever one you want to. Some businesses do not do that. They actually come already sealed. I know one person in a different city who's doing that. I'm sure there are others as well. And they come grouped, but within the group, it's sealed, and you don't get to, so to speak, choose which one you want to. Okay. So one last point before we get to some of the details of how to deal with this esrog is I had mentioned to you that the Or Sameach says that if something is picked specifically for the mitzvah, then doesn't have kedusha shvius to it. So he asks himself. He said, how can I tell you if you pick it for the mitzvah it doesn't have kedusha shvius? If so, an esrog that our esrogim shouldn't have kedusha shvius. If a person picked the esrog specifically to use in the mitzvah, how could it have kedusha shvius when it was picked for the mitzvah? Now, in other words, the case in the Gemara maybe was talking about a person who just happened to have an esrog in his backyard and pulled one off and happened to be selling it to someone else, maybe. But how could it? What about for us? Realistically, all of our esrogim are picked up specifically for the mitzvah. So if he was right that something picked for the mitzvah has no kedusha shvius, then that should be the same here also. So he answers that there's a Gemara in Sukkah on Daf Lamed Hey that talks about, not exactly, but basically that says that an esrog, in order to be kosher for the mitzvah, needs to be edible, needs to be allowed to eat it. So he says when a person picks an esrog off for the mitzvah, they are inherently taking it off to be a food item, because it's one of the requirements of a esrog that it be a food item. So when I say I'm picking it off for the mitzvah and I'm picking it off for food, it's the same thing. Picking it for the mitzvah has an element of picking it for food also, and therefore it has kedusha shvius. Okay, so let's move on. I will mention as a little side point, which is the Yerushalmi, not in Shvius, and I believe it's in Arlo, that asks whether trees that were planted specifically for the mitzvah have kedusha shvius, and it leaves it hanging. Seemingly we're machmir on that, because or else we wouldn't have kedusha shvius to it. Okay, so let's go on now to say we have our esrog. Of our four, meaning we have our esrog that has kedusha shvius to it. What are the dinim that apply to this esrog that has the kedusha shvius to it? Okay, so the first thing is that because we're getting our esrogim from Oitzer Bezdin, that means is there are no restrictions on how you pay for that esrog. What I mean to say is like this: Bezdin and their representatives, including the person in the store locally who's selling the esrog is a representative of Bezdin. Those people have an amount of their allowed to charge in order to recoup their expenses, but they're not charging anything for the fruit itself, and therefore there are no restrictions on the money. What kind of restrictions would there be? Well, the first is, the issue is, the reason why there should be restrictions are that if I buy something that has Kedusha Shvius to it, and I give the person $1 for that item that has Kedusha Shvius, then the $1 that I gave also absorbs Kedusha Shvius. So now, not only does the food that I buy have Kedusha Shvius, but so does the $1. If the person takes that $1 and buys himself a yarmulke with it, that yarmulke now the yarmulke has Kedusha Shvius. It actually goes off the money, transfers to the yarmulke. If the guy trades in that yarmulke for a banana, now the banana has a Kedusha Shvius, the yarmulke does not. So when a person pays money for something with Kedusha Shvius, the money and everything bought with the money will have Kedusha Shvius, and therefore the Gemara says you can't buy something from an Amoritz, from someone who's not going to be careful. You can't buy it from him, something Shemitah from him, because then he will have this $1 in his hand that he's not going to be used. He may not use in the way that he's supposed to, and he's not going to treat it with Kedusha Shvius. So therefore, you're not allowed to pay cash, and you have to either pay it on credit, which would be for us nowadays mean to buy it on a credit card or use a check. The place can say you can use a check also. You have to buy it on credit, so there's no cash changing hands for the fruit, or you have to buy it b'havla. You have to buy it together with something else, which is what the Mishnah talks about there, which is that you buy the lulav and the esrog comes along with it, so the money is not specifically for the esrog. Okay, so those are dinim that apply if a person actually pays for something with Kedusha Shvius. He actually pays for an esrog that has Kedusha Shvius. But nowadays, when we buy the Oitzer Bezdin, remember, we're not paying for the fruit that has Kedusha Shvius. We're paying for all the labor and the materials that were required to get that fruit to me, to make it grow and bring it to me. But I'm not paying anything for the fruit itself. And therefore, the money that I pay for the fruit has no Kedusha Shvius to it. There are no restrictions. I don't have to buy it b'havla. So some people, can still remember back to paying and saying, I'm buying the esrog and I'm getting the lulav with it. There are no such restrictions. In fact, the merchants we spoke to said, yeah, they would all take cash. They were totally not thinking that there's any restrictions, which is correct. If they're buying from an Oitzer Bezdin, there are no restrictions on that, on the way they use the money. Okay. The next is, the fruit has Kedusha to it, and therefore it means is that on Sukkot, and even after Sukkot, a person needs to treat it with Kedusha, with a certain respect, and more particularly, a person can't do anything that would take away from it being usable or edible. So that means is if I take my esrog, when Sukkot is over, the Ikra din is if I want to on a regular year, when I finish my esrog, I throw it in the garbage. Okay, I would not be allowed to do that on Shemitah. That would not be, first of all, that would not be the respect for it to put into the garbage, and also is that it makes it not edible. Once I throw it into the garbage with all the other things that are not nice or not desirable, nobody would want to eat this esrog after that. Okay, and for the same money, I can't take the esrog and stick it into a boiling hot spot where it's going to shrivel up very quickly, because again, I'm making it not edible. So I have to be careful to not do anything that would take away from the so to speak respect of it, or to make it not edible. But I don't have to do things to preserve it. So I don't have to actively try to keep it from spoiling. So, for example, I don't have to take it and put it into the refrigerator. Or there are people who will, stick cloves into the side of their esrog to keep it from keep it beautiful for many months afterwards. I don't have to do that. I don't have to consciously try to keep it from spoiling. But I'm not allowed to do anything that would make it get ruined. And therefore, that means as follows: Let's say during Shemitah, I use my esrog like regular. When Shemitah ends, I can leave it on the counter or in the box so that it can dry out. That's fine. I'm allowed to do that. If I do not require it, as I said, to stick the clothes into it, but I can just leave it as is. Now, come the time that it actually dries out, comes the time that it's completely withered and dried out, that nobody would want to eat it, or no one could eat it, then it has no more Kedusha to it. At that point, I can dispose of it like any other year. I can throw it in the garbage, get it from the Hilchos Shemittah, so I have to throw it in the garbage, and there's no problems once that happens. Now, but if, for example, the person had taken their esrog, stuck in clothes all over it so that it doesn't rot, Now, he wasn't required to do that, but he chose to do that. Then, if he comes a week after Sukkot, he would not be able to pull those clothes out, because doing that will cause them to rot. If a person had taken an esrog and stuck it into a sealed container, although I've seen people do that also, stick it into a sealed container so there's no air, and the esrog doesn't rot. Well, if he put it into the container, he wasn't required to do that. But once he did it, he can't open that up now, because doing that is causing it to get ruined. Okay, so if the person chooses to do something to preserve it once Sukkot is ending, or at some point on Sukkot, now he's not allowed to undo that, because that would be causing it to get ruined. Okay, so now, what are the rules? What will be the din when a person I have my esrog gift to Sukkot? As I said, you don't have to do anything to preserve it, but you shouldn't ruin it either. So, a person can use it in whatever is considered the typical ways of using a fruit. Each fruit in its own way, whatever the typical way. Some fruits are cooked or not cooked, or eat raw, you peel them. However you do, the typical ways of using it, you can use it. For an esrog, one of the common ways people would use it is to make jelly or jam out of it, which would be okay. You are allowed to do that. That's considered a typical use for you're allowed to do that. If somebody wants to do that or any of the other uses, they need to just talk it through with their Rav beforehand, because there are dinim to be conscious of when you're doing that, which is to say, as you cook it, to make sure you don't waste or ruin any of it, but with limits to how much you have to be careful. For example, if you cooked it up in a pot, how much you have to be careful about the leftovers that are in that pot that are there, to not waste them while they're still edible. So if a person's going to be doing that, they need to speak it over with somebody. But it is within reason to do that. We'll say a little more details in a second. Now, there are some other uses that people have for esrog. Rabbi Reese told me he's been asked by a number of people, have told him that they use their esrogim to make whiskey out of it. There's actually a shaila in the Reb Chaim Kanievsky brings a shaila about whether you can make whiskey out of things from Shemitah. Seemingly you should be allowed to, if that's a typical use. There aren't that many uses for esrogim, but this is one of them, and it's a question. The shaila is, you may be not allowed to turn it from a food into a drink. That's a question he speaks about. But if a person has a use that's considered a typical use, again, jam is the most typical, then they're allowed to do that. But what they need to keep in mind with these things is that the mitzvah of beer, I had mentioned earlier, the mitzvah of beer. What's the mitzvah of beer? The mitzvah of beer is that when the produce of Shemitah is hefker, and anyone can take it. And I can take as many as I want to. If I walk into the field and I want a dozen oranges, that's fine, I'm allowed to take what I want to. Until the time that there are no more available out in the field, to reach a certain point that there are basically nothing left in the field, at that point, I'm not allowed to hold on to any significant amount of fruit. I'm allowed to keep mazon shal shudas, a tiny amount I'm allowed to keep for myself, but the rest of it, basically, I can't have, boxes and boxes of the stuff in my house. So when it comes that time, when the time of beer comes for the fruit, I am required to go out and make it hefker and make it available that anybody who wants to could take it. I can take some of it also, but I have to make it hefker that it's available for people to take. So, not only do I have to make it hefker, I'm supposed to do that in Eretz Yisrael. So that means is that when the time of beer comes, the time of beer for esrogim is assumed to be Rosh Chodesh Shvat. This year, that's January 11th of 2016. So when it comes that day, when it comes the beginning of Shvat, if my esrog is still edible, or my esrog is esrog jam, which is edible, or my esrog is a preserved esrog because I stuck pieces of cloves into it, or I turned it into whiskey, I did something that makes it that come Rosh Chodesh Shvat, this esrog is still edible, then that I'm required to do beer on that esrog. I can't do beer on that esrog, or I shouldn't do beer on that esrog here in Chicago. So what I have to do is, if I'm going to be making esrog jam, I have to think about how I make it. There are questions about to make sure you don't ruin it or waste it while making it. While I eat it, I have to make sure I don't waste it either. So I have to think about that. If I put jam on my bread and I don't finish the bread, I have to think about what do I do I can't throw that in the garbage until it gets inedible. But then also, if I didn't finish all of the jam or the whiskey or whatever before Rosh Chodesh Shvat, then I have to make arrangements that esrog should go back to Eretz Yisrael. So it's something worth bearing in mind. Obviously, if it comes from Chodesh Shvat and you still have it, but maybe even more so, a person who's thinking about making one of these food items has to plan ahead and say, if I'm going to be making esrog jam out of my esrog when Sukkot ends, then realistically, will I be able to finish it before the time of beer comes? Or if I won't be able to, do I have some way of getting it back to Eretz Yisrael? And I can't, I'm not just going to leave it in the airport. I have to think of a way to do it, to get it to Eretz Yisrael and do the mitzvah beer. So that's something that's worth thinking about when the person sits down after Sukkot and says, okay, you know what, let's stick this into a container and we'll keep it airtight and it won't get ruined. Okay, we'll keep our Shemitah Esrog forever. Well, it's not going to be really forever because eventually it is going to have to go back, particularly if someone has a number of them. They will have to go back and be brought to Eretz Yisrael. Okay, that's all that I have to say. Does anyone have any questions? Okay, thank you for listening. Oh,
yeah.
Go ahead.
Can I throw in a question?
Sure.
Yeah, with regards to esrogim that are coming from Eretz Yisrael, and whether they're from Otzer Bezdin or from some other mechanism of alternative to Otzer Bezdin, what other options could there be out there for esrogim from Perishvius?
Okay, there's three choices that I can think of. There's Otzer Bezdin. That's the most common that we're going to see. There are some fruits that will have grown as from farmers who relied on the heter mechira. From the farmer's perspective, there were no restrictions on what he could. There were very few restrictions on what he could do, and for those who accept the heter mechira, that food does not have kedusha shvius. He can export it. He can sell it to you. You can do whatever you want to do. There are no restrictions on it from the perspective of someone who accepts the heter mechira. If that esrog was to come to someone who does not accept the heter mechira, he would be allowed to use it for the mitzvah, but he would treat it with kedusha shvius. He would treat it with all the restrictions of kedusha shvius, including that he can't pay for it with cash and things like that, because it's a full kedusha shvius to it. So that's a middle case where the farmer, the seller, didn't consider it to have kedusha shvius, and the buyer potentially would. And the third case is if you'd find someone who didn't hold to the heter mechira, it didn't do the heter mechira. He just had esrogim. I mean, if you lived in some place and you have an esrog tree growing in your backyard, and you did what the Torah said, you made it hefker, and then anyone could take it. Well, that fruit clearly has kedusha shvius to it, and there, in that case, even the farmer didn't think that it doesn't have kedusha shvius. Not the middle case. The middle case, the farmer relied on the heter mechira. Here, the farmer happily tells you that it's hefker and everyone could use it. It's not part of any kulas. That for sure has kedusha shvius to it, and then the regular rules apply to it. Let me just say.
What I don't understand is that there was a recent, forgive me for asking a question about a different organization, but there was a recent memo that went out from the ICA and the OU indicating that the esrogim this year, because they have kedusha shvius, should be purchased together with the Arba Minim and not by themselves.
Okay. That couldn't be.
I'm hearing.
That wouldn't be talking. I didn't see this. I'm sorry. That would not be talking about the Otzer Bezdin ones. Ones that are from Otzer Bezdin, the money that you pay is not for the fruit. All those kind of restrictions don't apply. The money you're paying is for labor and boxes and things like that, and there are no restrictions on that. If you were to be buying one from, again, if you bought it from someone who sold it because he relied on heter mechira, and you did not want to rely on heter mechira, then that would be accurate. But if it's from someone who's from Otzer Bezdin, I wouldn't understand that language.
Thank you.
Yes.
Could you explain why you spoke critically about selecting, open boxes? So even if you said the price grouping is okay, but selecting is not. What's the problem with that? Why can't a person say, "Look, I don't care what I'm paying for. I'm paying for their effort. I'm paying for the labor. I don't want to. I want a nice esrog. I don't want to pay for the labor for something that I don't want to walk home with."
Okay.
Why is that a problem?
There's nothing inherently wrong with it. You won't open up a Shulchan Aruch and say, "Don't do that," because there's something wrong with that. But what's wrong is, as soon as the merchant allows people to start doing that, then in essence, or in appearance, what's going on is you're paying for the fruit. I look at two and I say, I like that one. How much is it? He says, $50. I said, I like that one. How much is it? $75. And then I make a choice whether I should buy it or not buy it based on the look of it. So then I'm giving at least the impression of buying it based on how I like the fruit. The fruit is hefker. I'm not paying more because I got a better box. I'm not paying because I like the guy's delivery. I'm paying more because I like the fruit. I don't know, I can't say it is, but it has an appearance of not really living up to the Oitzer Bestin.
What are the circumstances where mushroom sort of have different categories of Esrog, and they have Segala, Sebet, Segimel, and people in advance, like here in St. Louis, have to pre-choose which category they want. So they prepay for a Segala, for a Sebet, but once they've prepaid, now the Esrogim arrive. Within Segala, they can choose whichever one they want.
Okay, I guess that's what Rabbi Friedman is trying to say also, is that within if I'm paying my $50 for my Sug, whatever I get for $50, then why shouldn't I pick which one I want? I like this one better than that one. Okay, the reason why Pesachim talk against it is only because of the appearance of it. It becomes a slippery slope of it not really looking like I'm not paying for the fruit. You can argue, and again, you're going to see it here in Chicago. I don't know what's in St. Louis. Here in Chicago, the merchants we spoke to are not using closed boxes, and I guess that's what they're thinking. Is like, what's the difference? Once I'm charging for all the labor, blah blah blah, then why shouldn't I break it up?
Mm-hmm. Okay, another question.
Go ahead.
When you said that if the 1 second. Right. You said obviously there are three possibilities. Either you can't export them, either you can export them on that they're going to be returned, or stam mutter. So you said obviously they're not keeping the first, and at least in Chicago, at least the people you spoke to, are not keeping the second. So you said okay, but you said well that doesn't affect you. The consumer doesn't affect you. But did you mean? Is there any? If the consumer buys it, is he off the hook from trying to return it because just is the mocher already exported it? Can he say, well, you did the problem, you export Shlom and it's not my problem, or now it's my problem because I have it in my possession?
So, no, the din is that if a person has Perish Shvius out of Eretz Yisrael, he's not required to send them back. You don't have a mitzvah to bring them back until beer time. But other than beer, you're not, if it's out of Eretz Yisrael, you don't have to bring it back. All I said is that there are those who say, if you bring it out of Eretz Yisrael with the intention of bringing it back, then you're allowed to do it. So that's a judgment for the person taking it out. He may not be over anything because he took it out with the intention of bringing it back. That affects his being able to take it out. But once it got out, there's no mitzvah to bring it back. So if I have it, however it got here, I have it. I don't have to bring it back.
Except when it comes to beer, assuming it's still royalty.
If it's still edible, then I have a separate responsibility because of the beer of it. Okay, there is a little question. This I don't have an answer to, which is, the thing does say that if you took something, if it's out of Eretz Yisrael, you're allowed to eat it. It stays kosher. You're allowed to eat it, and you don't have to bring it back. But it also says you're not allowed to bring it mimakim l'makim. You're not allowed to take it from place to place. So I didn't see any place to explain what that means. And what are the details of that? Does that mean I can't take it from the Svarim store to my house? Does that mean I can't take it from here to New York? Well, what does it mean I can't take it mimakim l'makim in chutzards? Am I maybe restricted? Maybe I shouldn't be allowed to move it. I don't know what, a certain amount. That's like a type of taking it to chutzards. And I don't have a handle on what really that means. What's the definition of that to tell you what you can and can't do?
Okay.
Any more questions? Okay.
My last question, Hadassim, you spoke about the study Heter, but the Muslims say that, Bal Nefesh, Yachmir, and you should be careful with Hadassim as well. And,
so you know what? I didn't see people specifically saying that, but at the same time, on the one shaila about whether things meant for fragrance have Kedusha Shvius, the Chazon says you should be machmir about it. That in general he says you should be machmir. But the other question, what the Arsameach is saying is a chiddush. So the fact that people don't disagree with him, I don't know if that's so compelling,
Okay, but he's saying a chiddush l'kula. But if it's a Arsameach, then you're right to have a problem.
So according the fact that people don't say the opposite of him does not mean something. Doesn't prove that they didn't. Seemingly, it is meant for fragrance.
So if they're not going to, if they don't reckon with his chiddush, so then we should be back to saying we have a machmer like the Nish machmer on Avidu L'Reikos, so now we should have a
yes.
should have a problem on it.
Yes.
We should have a situation that we should treat it with Kashrus.
Potentially, yes. So what that means is for Hadassim, what it means for Hadassim is, basically it means is, don't throw them out till they dry out. There aren't really people preserving them or trying to keep them around. And, a few weeks after...
Sorry, again?
A few weeks after Sukkot, they'll be dried out, at which point you can throw them out. Burn them with your chametz.
So, is there a man beer on that?
I don't believe there's beer for those kind of things. I don't know. Didn't check a chart. I don't believe there's beer for those kind of things. But no, it's not like someone's going to keep it around. It's not like an esrog that will turn into jelly that I'm going to keep around. It's just going to, eventually it'll dry out. But it doesn't mean...
Yeah, because some people actually do. They take them off the stick and save them for the sun and for Shanim Rabbos.
Really? Does it really last a long time?
Yeah. I mean, it's dry out, but it's there. I have the dasim. I don't know what year they're from, but I have the dasim from many, many years ago in a glass jar. And
they keep the fragrance.
Part of my...
And they keep...
Well, I would admit, every few years, we add a little bit of cloves or we add some new stuff. So I can't tell you exactly how the ones from 10 years ago still smell. But overall, the thing has a wrath, and I haven't added to it as long as I can remember now. I haven't added anything, and it still has a wrath.
Okay, I believe you. Okay, so in which case I guess they would keep the Kedusha, that's...
I don't know if it's from Shemittah or Okay. Okay, thank you.
No problem. Okay, thank you everybody for listening. Have a great day.
Okay, Shikaya, thank you very much.
Very much.
Bye.